Um, Welcome to everybody, and thank you for coming to this special Hacked Off event. This is our what we call our annual Leveson lecture. We've had one of these every year since the Leveson report was published, except for last year because of COVID. I'm the chairman of Hacked Off, Hugh Tomlinson. As I'm sure all of you will know, Hacked Off was set up in 2011 to campaign for the rights of victims of press abuse and for a free and accountable press, to campaign for proper and effective press regulation to support the press and to support those that the press write about. We're delighted that so many people have signed up for this event. I think we've got well over 200. We don't charge for these events, but Hacked Off is an organisation which is supported financially by its supporters. So anybody who we certainly welcome donations to support our work and this event and other aspects of our work. You can make a donation on our website, or there's a link which has been shared in the Q&A. I'm now going to hand over to our host for the evening, Emma Jones, who is a member of the Hacked Off board and a journalist. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Hugh. Thanks everyone for being here tonight and for supporting the campaign. It's really good that we can get together like this in this sort of interactive way. I'm going to be putting audience questions to our speaker and our panel of experts later, and I think some of you have submitted questions beforehand, so thank you for them. Or you can also use the Q&A function that should be at the bottom middle of your Zoom screen, so have a look for that and feel free to put your questions there, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. If it's addressed to Hacked Off, we might write an answer in the Q&A section. If it's addressed to Jess or to the panel, we'll try and ask them individually later. So the subject of tonight's lecture is unethical press coverage and how it can affect specifically women. Firstly, I want to describe some of the work Hacked Off's done in this area. In general, we've been striving to improve the reporting of domestic violence, and for the last 2 years, Hacked Off has worked with leading campaign organisations such as Refuge, White Ribbon and Justice for Women to call for regulatory reforms to improve reporting. We've also called for reforms to specific standards to address undue sexualisation of women in public life, and to end the continued practice of some newspapers of printing upskirting style images of women. Our work's guided by the experts on violence against women and girls, and we'll be hearing from some of them on the panel. We're very grateful who are here tonight. But first, we'd like to hear from our main speaker, a woman who is at the very forefront of national action to address domestic violence. As the current Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding, she holds the government to account over policies in this area, and child sexual exploitation as well, and modern slavery. When she speaks on these issues, she does so with authenticity and knows well the human impact of these crimes. Because before entering Parliament, she worked with women affected by domestic violence, managing refuges for Women's Aid. We'd like to thank Jess in advance for delivering the 7th annual Leveson lecture, the Member of Parliament for Birmingham Yardley and Shadow Home Office Minister, Jess Phillips.
Well, thank you very much. I feel like I should just start by saying I do have some notes, but I don't tend to be particularly, well, I'm not very formal in the way I address people. So, whilst this is called a lecture, I very much doubt that, or hope that people don't feel, I suppose, lectured to, but that I can speak with passion and with fluency on these particular issues. I'm going to focus my remarks on domestic violence reporting and specifically what press misogyny does in the real world, the effect that it has directly on the real world, because it could very much seem that discussing sexism at work, misogyny in the press, they seem as if they are small issues as part of a bigger cause, and that they are tinkering around the edges. But in reality, the way that women are represented in our media around us, in every single place that we look, makes an enormous difference in whether we are safe in our homes, whether we are safe on the streets, and whether we have liberation in our lives. It's not just to say that it's terrible the way that domestic abuse gets reported in the media, which I obviously I'm about to go on to say. It is to say that the very representation of women and the way that domestic abuse is represented, certainly, and violence against women and girls is represented in the media, actually is a contributing factor to making women less safe in our country and around the world. Domestic violence and sexual violence don't occur because people are intrinsically violent, and by people I mean largely the perpetrators of these crimes are men, because men are intrinsically violent. It's not an anger management issue. Rape is not a crime about sex. All of these crimes are about power and control. And whilst women have a lesser position in society, women will always be at the mercy of those who have more power, and will always be able to be abused by those who can control them. And so it is on all of us. The only way really to end violence against women and girls is the equalisation and the liberation of women. Until we are equal in society and considered equally, we will still always be less safe and more likely to be victims of violence at the hands of men. And it is the responsibility of everybody to be working towards making women in society be elevated to that point. And so when women in society, when we look at our newsstands, when we turn on our TV reporting, when women in society are still judged wholly by the way that they look, me as a female politician, I cannot tell you the amount of times that people have commented on the clothes that I wear, the size of my breasts, the colour of my teeth, in a manner that I very, very much doubt that Andy Burnham has ever had to deal with, or George Osborne, any particular column inches written about his waistline that I have not seen. The reality is that the way we talk about women are presented in media makes a difference in how women in society are viewed. And so it matters. It matters than just, I'm Mary Whitehouse. I absolutely love the idea that I'm some sort of a prude. The best retort of this I ever saw was that somebody had written on Twitter that I was a man-hater, and someone from my school had written, that's not what it said about her on the toilets at school. I'm not a prude. This is not about whether the issues of the past around women in newspapers. I am here to express that misogyny in our media, it is holding women back, and we have to move forward with that. So I'm going to focus initially on domestic violence and how domestic violence is reported. I cannot stress enough how dangerous the reporting of domestic violence is on the future of how juries react to domestic violence and on the likelihood of action and conviction in these cases. For too long, domestic violence has not been criminalised in the way that it should be, because people believe that in the idea of a crime of passion. A crime of passion is a brilliant story. I understand that. The idea that somebody can flip out at one moment and that it isn't part of a general and broader pattern of abuse is one that is understandable for the viewing public and those reading newspapers. It lets them off the hook. It makes them feel as if, well, this couldn't happen to me because, you know, I didn't put myself in this situation with a person who could flip out. And it tells a story, like a narrative of a film, the idea of a crime of passion, of a moment of madness. And this is almost exclusively how every domestic homicide is reported, pretty much. You know, there aren't, I might say there aren't worst offenders, there are absolutely worst offenders, but it's pretty much across the board that when you see the outcome of a domestic homicide case, you will read the account of the defence, because the account of the defence is salacious in most parts and it makes for the best copy. So I'm going to refer to one particular case, the case of a woman called Yvonne McCann. And she was murdered. Her trial was recently concluded around 3 months ago. And the newspaper reporting about it, by and large, and I looked today across pretty much, so I went, you know, the full gamut, The Guardian, down to the sort of Daily Star, and every single newspaper article that I read about it told the story about how the argument that had led to the death of Yvonne McCann was over frozen chips, was over an argument about frozen chips. That the final, you know, it had been brewing up, this violence, but this final thing that made him strangle Yvonne McCann to death, then cut up her body and seek to get rid of it, was an argument about frozen chips. Now, I understand that maybe makes a good story, but what that does is it makes Yvonne McCann's death about an argument, not a pattern of years of creeping control, aggression, slow and steady, cutting her down until she felt that she could not escape and would be left at the mercy of somebody who would kill her over frozen chips. There is no, I read nowhere any explanation of domestic violence and what leads to domestic homicide. In none of the reporting did I read even a second of that. The worst case around this case that I read was in the Daily Mail, which wrote, you know, beyond the frankly exciting seeming thing about frozen chips, the Daily Mail wrote, Miss McCann began to see another man around 2013, leading to her husband's jealousy and relationship breakdown, fatal domestic violence reporting, and ultimately leading to her death. There is a paragraph there that actually no, I don't need to read into it. It explicitly draws a line between the actions of the victim and her death. Like, she had an affair, he got jealous, she's dead. Had she not had an affair, she would not be dead, is what that says. Because of course, you know, it's very clear that everybody who has an affair ends up dead. That's why there's so many murders of men in our country by their partners. There isn't. Because having an affair does not cause anybody to die, and reporting it as such, what should have been reported is that Yvonne McCann lived with an aggressive, jealous, violent man who used his jealousy about her behaviours to control her and ultimately kill her. That was not reported in this case. So you know, this, I cannot count the ways that it is wrong how this was reported, and this is after this was 3 months ago. That this case was being reported. This is after we have had all of these conversations about what is wrong in these cases. We are meant to be at a better state around how we report domestic abuse. The idea that a murderer flips out, and that in a moment something occurs, something bad happens, and that therefore we, sort of plead leniency on behalf of the murderer. You wouldn't do that if he'd murdered a stranger. You wouldn't say, oh, somebody just flipped out on the street and just went and stabbed somebody to death because they were really, quite stressed out about the fact that it was lockdown. You would never accept that in the case of a murder of a stranger. And yet it is the common parlance that is reported when we hear about domestic abuse cases. It is the article, the passage from the Daily Mail takes the biscuit because beyond the flip out crime of passion theory, it has leaned on the misogyny and victim blaming that aim to paint the woman who has been murdered as the adulterer. So it's not even just victim blaming. There's a slightly salacious thing about this woman. We must talk about her previous sexual exploits. And that, I don't know anything about the perpetrator's previous sexual exploits, but I do know it about the victim. There is something fundamental about how this often plays out. And the only line I can draw is that it's because it's being written by people who are misogynistic. They see women differently to how they see men. Women are kept at a different standard of their behaviour to that of men. Can you imagine in this country if I, just even as a sort of front bench, low down ministerial job, opposition front bench, can you imagine if I perpetrated the same level of sexual freedom, I'm going to call it, to be fair, as that gets talked about with regard to the Prime Minister? Now, I'm not suggesting that it doesn't get talked about, that it doesn't get reported. It does, but there's absolutely no way I would be given the same benefit of the doubt as a woman. I would be being painted as being a bad mother. I would be being painted as being somehow a difficult character. The idea of women having sex is so often represented in our media as being somehow base. And in the worst cases, when we see that, is when we talk about the previous sexual history of people who've been murdered by their partners. The second area where domestic abuse gets reported really poorly is the idea of a loving father, which gets said over and over again, especially when children are murdered as a pattern of the same domestic abuse, is this idea that a loving father was driven by something we assume not being looked after and cared properly for. He's been driven to murder his wife and his children in one fell swoop. I think that the best writing about this has come from two young men, Ryan and Luke Hart. Ryan and Luke Hart's father Lance killed their mother Claire and their youngest sister Charlotte. And the brothers have gone on over the years since those killings to explain how the media reporting in the wake of the murders added to their trauma. Luke said press coverage described the murderers as rare and isolated, and one even labelled it understandable. He went on to say that the newspapers attempted to explain how a good man and a good father had killed his family, not that he was a terrorist in clear sight. It is one thing to read a misrepresentation of the father that you knew to be obsessive and controlling as if he was a loving father who had just snapped in an isolated incident. But what Luke and Ryan Hart have said regarding their case about their father's actions beforehand are chilling when considering the misogynistic reporting of domestic abuse. They said, our father had been searching online about men who killed their families for the weeks before and saw media outlets justifying their actions. Newspapers may not realise it, but in lots of cases, the reporting of such crimes gives the reader a moment of justification for why the murder happened. It makes the reader feel at ease, as if it won't happen to them. And that is the gift that victim blaming gives the onlooker. It allows people to continue to think that women have a role in their own abuse and that somehow they, as the reader, can control and make sure that it won't happen to them. but it also allows potentially violent men reading it to empathise with the murderer. And that is truly dangerous. Before we go on to the way that rape is handled by juries, the way that domestic violence, when it isn't homicide, is handled by juries, all jurors will not necessarily, will almost never have an understanding of the pattern of power and control and coercion over a period. But you can bet your bottom dollar they're all aware of the idea of somebody flipping out, a moment of madness, an isolated incident. And that is because that is what they are told over and over and over again. So it affects justice and it affects juries, and it is not to be undermined as if it's just, wouldn't this be nice to change? This needs to change. And what was outlined about what can be done has been very clearly laid out by Hactoff. So there is hope. There is a way of reporting this. And if I think not perfect, but over the years, the way that suicide, death by suicide has been reported, how there has been a code of practice, was absolutely not perfect. There have been improvements, but this needs to be the case in cases of domestic violence, because it genuinely will help to save lives. Just to touch briefly on other forms of misogyny, but remaining within, like I say, you don't have to look very far to find endless examples. Most days newspaper stands have a woman stood scantily clad on their front pages. I'm just really not entirely sure why. Maybe it sells papers for somebody to be on a beach. But the way that politicians get talked about, images of women's underwear, as has already been mentioned. Personally, I think that it should be a criminal. It sits right within the criminal framework of upskirting that exists. If you publish, you might accidentally take a photo of somebody's knickers as they get out of a car and go onto the red carpet. That's one thing to accidentally take it. You then publish it. It's no longer an accident that image exists, or because that's what drives the demand. Is the fact that it can be published, that picture will be worth something. But the way that images of women are used is absolutely ripe for regulation and control, as far as I'm concerned. But returning to how terrible, heinous crimes are reported, where the starkest examples are seen. I work week in, week out with victims of terrorism, the most high-profile sexual and domestic abuse cases, and also with families of homicide victims, both domestic abuse and other forms of homicide. And this is what some of them have told me about their images and how they've been used. So one young woman said, who survived a very high-profile violence case, "I hate it when they use my image and his image side by side. The use of the images of both victims and perpetrators together is something I have always found distressing. Papers would always put our pictures side by side, providing a visual link and a connection I as a victim don't want to see, and I'm sure that other families of victims don't want to see it." Another commented, "The obsession with images is now readily fed by the world of social media, where the media routinely pillage and steal people's private photos to use in their reporting. At the time of my crime, this wasn't possible, and there was initially only a couple of photos used by the papers. So desperate were they to make their reporting look distinctive, or perhaps my image wasn't sexy enough, that they photoshopped a picture of me to make it look like I was wearing makeup when I wasn't. This sounds laughable as I write it, given the gravity of the crime, but nonetheless it happened. Although this was a long time ago, I think this behaviour is still endemic, where the media seek to use images of women that further sexualise them and try to control the image of them as a victim, rather than allowing that control to go to that person. And the idea that we live in a world where if you were blown up by a terrorist tomorrow and you are a woman, you can bet your bottom dollar that within hours a photo of you in a bikini will surface. And that is what misogyny looks like, is that when there is a story to tell about a woman, we have to seek to sexualize that story somehow, whether she's a politician, whether she's a teenager just murdered, whether she is the perpetrator of a crime. There is always an effort to look at women and how we report on women in a way that is different to how we report on men. And I can't stress enough how important a free press and a decent press is going to be as we go forward in the push to end violence against women and girls, because there is a backlash that always comes as progress. The march of progress comes, there is always a backlash. And following the Me Too movement, and again will happen following the recent outpouring over the Sarah Everard murder, is that one thing I am seeing happening over and over again is the idea that women using their voices in our free press or in our or online on their own social media, is that women are being hit with cease and desist orders by rich lawyers seeking to stop them talking about their experiences of violence, sexual violence and sexual harassment. And it is going to take the allyship of a free press to tell that story well, and to not allow the voices of women to be silenced as we go forward. And you know, it might seem anathema certainly to this audience, but you know, if I think of the incidents where the Sun took on the case of the Johnny Depp trial, and actually when I look at the Sun newspaper and the work that I have done with them around refuge funding, there is absolutely a place for the media that appears sometimes the scariest to be pushing forward for women's voices to be heard as the backlash occurs, and as we talk about our experiences and how they are being silenced, because that is definitely going to come. So they can change the public narrative, which would genuinely save women's lives. And some do it well, some do it brilliantly and then let you down the next week. Some repeatedly fail, no matter how many times they are told. So I want regulation and guidance so that all report well. It won't end the story. It doesn't stop the story. It just doesn't reduce years of abuse and violence to being about a bag of chips.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jess. That was excellent. In fact, you've already talked about some of the things that I was just going to touch upon before we move on to the next to the panel. Just briefly, some supporters have asked about the way you've been targeted with harassment, abuse and threats, in particular by a man. And I know this is probably quite raw and recent.
No, it's fine.
He was recently sentenced to prison for 2 years, is that correct? Mm-hmm. Do you believe that the prejudice coverage of women in the press contributes to some of the hate that's on social media? Do you think that there's a sort of a spiralling effect? Do you think it amplifies the way that women are treated on social media?
Absolutely. Without question, the way that women are presented, wherever it is we see them, affects the way that spirals in both online and in real life. Because, you know, men aren't born thinking that women are sex objects, that they are lesser, that they, you know, that they are taught that by the environments that they find themselves in. So the people who've gone to prison and the ones who are awaiting trial for abusing me, they have been told over and over and over again that my status in the world is directly a result of them not having something. The fact that I'm a woman who has achieved something, I could only have done that by squashing down men. And that then unfortunately feeds into a terrible dialogue about the reality is that we constantly are reminded that women are either sex objects or lesser, and when they dare to breach past that and refuse to sit in that lane for whatever reason, because they wear a hijab or they get an uppity job, when we refuse to be defined by those, that you will suffer violence and abuse and aggression, because people want you in your lane. The best story I could tell about how pernicious this is, and that men aren't born with it, but society and everywhere we look gives it to them, is my son. We read a headline in a newspaper that said MP's son attacked in KFC. It was in the Sun newspaper in the CAF, and my son held up the paper and said, "Mummy, do you know this man whose son's been harmed?" And I looked at this newspaper story, and it was about a woman. It was about a female MP's son. But my son, who is the son of an MP, that headline was literally about him. He assumed that when it said MP, that it meant a man. He has been given that by somebody.
That's interesting. It's interesting what you were saying as well about the sort of arbitrary nature of the way that a newspaper like The Sun reports domestic violence. Yes, okay, there may be a few incidents where they have done a good job, but I think it's the way that we have to rely on luck for that. So I think this leads quite well into a question we've got from Janey Smith, who says basically, how much support is there, real support from within the Labour Party, for root and branch reform of our media, which has so degraded our democracy and deepened social divisions? Because effectively, I think for a substantial change and a meaningful change to happen, it's got to lie in some sort of branch reform, really. What do you think?
I think that there is appetite for it. I'm not going to lie and say that it's the top priority of the Labour Party. Yeah, absolutely isn't. I won't lie to you. But I think that there is appetite to change. Certainly, things like the things I've been talking about, where reporting damages society, I think that there's definitely, and if we look post, the sort of Millie Dowler case, and post the absolute worst ravages, the way that the McCanns were treated, then I don't think, I was about to say, I don't think anyone could argue that we didn't need it to be more robust, and yet people have argued it repeatedly for a very long time. But look, I think that there is the appetite to do it fearlessly, and I think that you can. I think that you can do it without seeming as if you are completely hostile to all the media. And that's where the Labour Party, I think, maybe went wrong in the last couple of years, is that you got nowhere to go from the point of complete hostility.
Yeah. Well, I'm conscious of time, so I think we'll move on to the panel. We'll hear more from you, Jess, there. So thanks so much for that. That was really brilliant. So we're now going to hear from a panel of experts on press regulation and newspapers and portrayals of women. Joining Jess tonight, we've got Natalie Fenton, who's Professor of Media and Communications at Goldsmiths University and Chair of the Media Reform Coalition. We also have prominent journalist Shaista Aziz, who is an anti-racism, women's rights and equalities campaigner and is currently head of media at Solace Women's Aid. And finally, we've got Janey Starling, who is co-director of Level Up, the feminist campaigns organisation that introduced the UK's first media guidelines for the reporting of fatal domestic abuse. So thanks for all of you for joining us. Start with a quick question for Janey. What do you think are the most common problems in press reporting of domestic abuse, and why is it so important for press reporting to improve in this area?
I'll go with the second question. So the reason it's most important is because we live in a country where 2 women a week are murdered by a partner or ex-partner, and the way that we talk about those deaths in the press informs the way we talk about those deaths in our communities. And ultimately, if we want to stop more women being killed, we need to drastically change the way we talk about it. And by that, I mean, we need to stop blaming women for their own deaths. But also, most importantly, and Jess touched on this earlier, the way that the press reports a fatal domestic, like a killing basically, where a man has killed his partner or ex-partner, they will report it as if it just happened out of the blue. Now, anyone who understands domestic abuse knows that fatal domestic abuse comes after a long-standing pattern of coercive control. So it actually, you know, the press is all about accuracy and truth, and it's completely inaccurate to suggest that somebody has, you know, flipped or has, you know, acted out of a jealous rage, when actually this person has a long-standing history of violence and control. And if we want to end these murders in our society, which we desperately need to, we need to acknowledge those histories of violence and control. And also for women who are reading these articles, who might recognise controlling behaviour in their own partner, we need to see newspapers and online outlets actually signposting people to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline. We need people to actually provide the information on what domestic abuse looks like, what the risk factors for homicide look like. So that's why Level Up has worked closely with Luke and Reinhardt, has worked closely with families who have been affected by domestic homicide to produce the UK's first media guidelines. So, you know, in the same way that suicide is treated as a public health issue when it comes to reporting, and journalists have to be very careful about what they write about a suicide, we're doing the same thing with fatal domestic abuse. So, you know, when a woman has been killed by a partner or ex-partner, we want journalists to kind of see that story and think, I need to be really careful about the way I approach this, because it has really huge public health impacts. And what I will add is this, you know, guidelines campaign has been going on for 3 years, but it's evident that guidelines just aren't enough. And there's a petition, hopefully Sarah or Nathan can share it, that Level Up is calling for code change from the regulators, because as much as I believe that we need to train journalists, it needs to come from the ground up, we also need the regulators to uphold the standards. So we're calling for a change to the IPSO Editors Code to say that, you know, in cases where a person has been killed by a partner, former partner or other family member, any language which suggests that the murder is justified or otherwise would blame the victim really cannot run. It needs to be completely omitted from those reportings, because that's, you know, that's some of the most pernicious reporting which really, you know, floods into our public consciousness and ends up completely removing any accountability from people, and also prevents us from actually being able to have honest conversations about how we end this violence.
Absolutely. I think that I've got a question that I'd like to direct to Shaista, actually. This has come from Roz, so thank you, Roz. Following Sarah Everard's murder, there was a lot of Make the Streets talk, and there was a lot of media attention focused on that. But would you agree that there needs to be more of a cultural shift? Do you think that that's enough? Do you think that it should start with the media, schools, and you know, what are your views on that question?
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to thank you, Jess, and Janey as well, for the work that Level Up's been doing on the guidelines, and also Natalie for the work each of you do day in, day out. So as we know, violence against women and girls, misogyny, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, it doesn't happen randomly. It's part and parcel of the DNA of society and cultures, all societies around the world. And in the past year, during the pandemic, we've seen record numbers of women reporting domestic abuse. And we know domestic abuse is one of the most underreported crimes in this country for multiple reasons, including the way the police handle complaints when, and you know, accusations when women do eventually manage to speak to them. So of course, this is a societal-wide issue. And I think that we have to see violence against women and girls and misogyny as a public health issue. I know somebody on the panel has already said that. But that's where we're at, and we have to look at it from that lens, because otherwise what we're doing is we're kind of implying that these are sort of one-off incidences that happen, and then another random one-off incident happens, but that's not how violence is perpetuated in our societies, and we know that. And I think what's really interesting for me, in the introduction you said that, you know, I work on anti-racism as well, is the synergy between racism and misogyny. So what I mean by that is it's really interesting for me that nobody really wants to admit to knowing a misogynist. Nobody wants to admit to knowing a man who is violent at home, or, you know, whichever sphere, the public sphere. Nobody ever wants to admit to that. Just like nobody ever wants to admit they know someone's a racist. And the reason for this is the way that these issues are framed. We know, society knows that it's not acceptable to beat and dehumanize and belittle women, or anyone for that matter. I believe society knows that, which is one of the reasons why there are all these codes of silence everywhere. And the same thing goes for racists as well. So we get into this kind of caricature. We create these caricatures of X was a bad man, you know, but Y wasn't so bad. You know, she wasn't really a racist. She didn't mean what she said. You know, he's a racist over there. We're getting into all of this kind of nonsense, basically, which is not getting us anywhere at all. And when it comes to these issues, when it comes to the media reporting, when it comes to women of color and Black women in particular, the horrific treatment of the press takes on another dimension. And I think we need to look at that. And I think that quite a lot of feminists are actually failing to apply intersectionality to the analysis of this work. And I'll just give you a quick example. Sarah Everard's case absolutely deserves all the attention. Of course it does. You know, we're not in a situation where we're going to start grading which woman deserves to, you know, get attention and which doesn't. But if we look at the case of Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry, these are two women who were killed in a park in London. And then we know that the Metropolitan Police officers were involved in taking photos of these dead women, selfies of two Black women, and then circulating them. This is obviously beyond horrific. There's an extreme racialized dimension to this. If we look at the case of Shamima Begum, who is someone who has been portrayed as a monster, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that she was groomed as a young girl from the streets of London. She left this country. We need to ask ourselves how that happened. And we all know how the media's covered this story. It's utterly horrific. It has extreme implications for everyday women who look like me, who wear the hijab. I know because I speak to those women and they tell me how terrifying it is for them to see those headlines splashed across the popular press. There needs to be accountability. When we talk about issues around honor crimes, for example, when it comes to race and the intersection of violence against women and girls, you know, women who are not white, their cultures become essentialized. You know, you look at the issue of Banaz Mahmood, who was 20 years old when she was killed in a so-called honor crime. The reason why I say so-called is there's no honor in killing a woman, okay? But she died there was a conviction in 2006. Her family members were involved in killing her. She went to the police multiple times before she was killed. She was failed. That side of the story is very rarely told in the same way as the side of the story around the honor killing. And I think that these are the things we have to really focus on and hold the press accountable for. You know, just as you rightly talk about the sexualization of women, but we also have brown and Black women who are over-sexualized in different ways to white women. And then we also have women who are not deemed to be women because they choose to wear a hijab or a niqab. Their actual, their right to be a woman is taken away from them daily by the portrayal of the British media. And migrant women as well. There's a whole category of women who become further othered by the British media. This is happening day in, day out on a cross-section of stories. Final point, if we look at COVID, I'm sick to the back teeth of seeing images of multicultural cities, like multicultural meaning there's quite a few brown people who live there. And the image they always show is of a mosque minaret and a group of women walking past dressed in a traditional shalwar kameez or a hijab. And the story headline is about COVID. And the code there, it's not very subtle. There's nothing subtle about any of this. So what we're seeing is a lot of issues kind of collapsing into one when it comes to the issue of how the media portrays violence against women and girls and domestic abuse. And this country's got a horrific track record in terms of the way the media reports on a number of issues, including this one. And we urgently need to see accountability. There is no excuse for any more of this. And I'm really pleased that Hacked has organised this event because I think we need to be far more visible and far more vocal on these issues.
Thank you. I think it's probably a good time actually to go to Natalie to you know, having talked about the state we're in, what's the difference, where are we in terms of the hope of that sort of regulation and the hope of changing the media landscape? What's the difference between the two media complaints handlers we have at the moment in terms of the press, that being Impress and Ipso? And how can good regulation make a difference here, and how can it happen?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. So we have these two press regulators at the moment, Impress and Ipso. but only Impress is what we call a recognised regulator under the Royal Charter system brought in as a result of the Leveson inquiry. So only Impress meets those Leveson recommendations for a fair and effective system of press regulation. But all national newspapers have actually rejected Impress. And now Impress only really covers quite small independent publications. Ipso, on the other hand, covers about 2,600 publications, including the majority of the national press. And they refused to adopt the system that was recommended by Leveson and endorsed under the Royal Charter. In 2013, the Media Standards Trust did an analysis of Ipso's framework, and they said that it only met 12 of the 38 Leveson recommendations within it. It works, Ipso works really, its main function is a complaints handler. And in order to deal with complaints, it has an editor's code. So you can complain if you see some reporting that you think hasn't stood up to the editor's code of practice. Now, they have published the guidelines from Level Up that Janey was talking about, but only as guidelines. So they've refused to integrate them. And in some ways, that's more insulting than ever. They recognise that this is worthy, but refuse to actually make it compulsory. So journalists aren't required to follow them, and there's no sanction against them when they don't. So, and the things that Level Up wanted to include, as Janey said, weren't, it's not like they're asking for the earth. These are very sensible requirements on reporting. And Hacked Off have called similarly for a specific clause on domestic violence to be covered in the editor's code. And again, it covers very simple things, like in cases where a woman's been killed by a partner, former partner, or other family member, language which appears to justify the member of, or otherwise blame the victim for her death should be avoided. Now that seems really quite simple and straightforward, right? This is not a massive interference in the freedom of the press. This is just reporting justly. It's reporting well. Hacked Off have also called for the insertion of 2 clauses covering things like objectification and upskirting, as we've spoken about, and as Jess mentioned. The Mail calls these wardrobe malfunctions. Actually, as Jess said, these are very explicit ways of actually using the objectification of women to sell newspapers. And all of these Ipso have refused to include. And that leaves us with a very major problem, because the code itself is inadequate even as it stands. So if you are going to make a complaint, you can only complain within their code of practice in a very, very narrow way, explicitly on the point in which you as a complainant are named. So if there are broader issues within that article, you can't actually, they will refuse to acknowledge or look at those. They will only look at the specific area of complaint related to your name. And that's difficult. You can see how difficult that can be in reporting around things like domestic violence or sexual violence. It also doesn't allow discriminatory reporting about social groups. So you can only complain if you're a named person. You can't complain about the reporting of women in general. You can't complain about the reporting of Muslims or transgender people or travellers. You can only complain if you're a named person. And again, the Media Standards Trust has called that, it's really a license to discriminate. You can do wholesale discriminatory reporting against women, and no complaint can ever be made that will be upheld. And even in cases where Ipso does consider a complaint from someone with the standing, with that very narrow possibility of making a complaint about that breach of code, they will go to considerable lengths to absolve its members of blame. So it's a very long drawn out process that very rarely results in the complainant's issue being upheld. And even when they do rule in favour of the complainant, they're perfectly happy to see an apology or a correction buried on page 36 in the bottom hand corner. So you get small scale, lacking in prominence corrections that are very unlikely to be noticed by many people at all. So, it's highly unsatisfactory. Impress also has a standards code. So Impress is the body that is recognised under the Royal Charter system. And it's true, they don't have a clause explicitly for things around domestic violence either, or sexual violence, but they do have clauses that cover it in other ways. So their clauses around privacy say there are reasonable expectations of privacy, and they've found against things like upskirting, whereas IPSO haven't. And they say you shouldn't exacerbate grief through intrusive news gathering or reporting. And again, they would include issues that we've spoken about this evening in that. Now, I think there's a blind spot in Impress's code around issues of objectification. But again, the independent publishers that they cover, things like that are actually pretty rare. Importantly, and this I think is vital, Impress does have a clause which enables you to complain over kind of hatred of women expressed against women as a group. So they have a discrimination clause 4, which allows you to actually complain about social groups. And that's a major difference to IPSO. Now, I think, good regulation in this area is absolutely imperative, because it states that sexism and misogyny are unacceptable. Now, I actually find it shocking that we even have to argue that case, that we have to say that in our national media, sexism and misogyny should be unacceptable. And frankly, it's sickening in a world where sexual violence against women and children is so endemic that the likes of IPSO want to retain their right to include discriminatory content, really on the grounds of entertainment. So regulation is vital, and really, it needs to come quick. We can't wait any longer for this to be changed.
Well, yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. Interesting as well, when you look at the sort of membership of organisations like IPSO and how that kind of cross-contaminates with some of the owners of the newspapers themselves. It's interesting too that 5 of the largest privately owned newspapers, the Telegraph, and the Sun, the Times and the Sunday Times, and none of them are independently regulated, of course, and they're all owned by men. So just a quick answer from you all. Do you think that that's a factor in the portrayal of women in those newspapers?
Yeah, I think Natalie's hit the nail on the head, which is so much of our news has become entertainment. It's really hard to to be able to decipher what is news coverage and what is entertainment. And currently in this country, we're in the middle of a manufactured culture war around racism. And in many ways, there's a manufactured culture war around misogyny and sexism and the dehumanizing of women that's going on every day as well. And I think more and more people out there anyway are starting to understand this. But also I think there's a shift happening in a lot of newsrooms where, journalists are quietly trying to, push and advocate in their newsrooms. And Janey, I know you spend a lot of time talking to journalists, so you know a lot about this. But I think some of the reporting around the Sarah Everard case, for example, there was, a small window, wasn't there, when you started hearing, more diverse section of women, for example, being allowed to speak. But it's only on 1 or 2 issues. It's not across the board. But yeah, I think this is one of the problems that we have, the way that, the news has become entertainment, and it's become clickbait and fodder, basically, and it's just not acceptable.
I mean, it's interesting, I think, Emma, when you ask, is it a problem that all of these organisations are owned by men? Well, I think concentration of ownership is a massive problem. We have 3 companies that control 90% of our national newspaper market. And yes, they are all men. But do I think if one of them was Rebecca Brooks, a former editor of News of the World and the Sun, that things would change? No, I don't think they would change, because the political economic model for the majority of newspapers is unbridled commercialism, and sex and violence sells, and challenging patriarchy may be good for democracy, but not for shareholder profits. So I think, we need regulation that both prevents concentration of media ownership and enables a much more diverse media ecology. And we need a regulatory environment that encourages different forms of media ownership, such as co-ops or not-for-profit journalism. And then we might start to see a very different type of journalism and reporting. If you look to the media co-ops that we've got now, things like the Bristol Cable, yes, it's only a small local newspaper, but it reports on issues in a very, very different way. Mm. So, I think it's, and we also have to recognise that violence against women is a systemic issue, and it hits women journalists too. And I think, Jess touched on that. And I think, that's an issue that the news industry has also got to tackle and take hold of.
So much to say. There's so much we could say about all of that, and the kind of the makeup of a newsroom itself, and the cultural practices within them as well. But we don't really have any time, unfortunately. So I'd just like to thank everybody, but particularly thank Jess for delivering the 7th annual Leveson lecture. Thanks to all of our panelists for coming today and for a great discussion. I wish we could continue it a bit further, and hopefully we will do in the future. Thanks for all of you who tuned in. I'm sorry that I couldn't get to all of the questions, but I think Jess touched on quite a lot of them, that some of the questions you might not have seen during her lecture. Please do follow us on Twitter at Hacking Inquiry if you don't already, and sign up to support the campaign via our email on the website if you haven't already. Tonight's event there's no charge for, but we'd really like to do more events like this, and would welcome donations to support events like this going forward. It's really important to the campaign's work, so that, you know, it's always a bit tedious to say that, but it's important to say that too. And you can make a donation on our website or in the link which has been shared in the Q&As. You should be able to find that link pretty easily. Thank you again for your support, and we hope that we'll see you again. We hope to talk about this more in the future, and we hope to see progress in this area in the future. Great to see you, and look forward to the next Hacked Off event. Thank you all very much, and good night.